Welcome to episode 2 of Blender and Science. They say that done is better than perfect, so here we are. But this is an episode that I've been looking forward to a while. There's a ton of great stuff in here, from the figure recreation that you see on the screen now to a number of added little tips and tricks, new breakdowns of very specific things, some assets that I'm releasing, some things that are coming up soon, hopefully the next major tutorial, certainly, and also a absolutely jam-packed community showcase highlighting all kinds of things that have happened in the Blender scientific community and the Blender community at large, as well as a quick look into my own reading list. Without any further waiting, let's get into the video. There are timestamps in the description breaking up the different parts for those who want to skip ahead. This will be a bit of a long one. This is a relatively simple procedural optical breadboard that I created. I did this after being inspired by Microsingularity's tutorial on using the LuxCore render engine to create lasers in Blender. I recommended that in episode 1, and I've been exploring it a bit myself. I wanted to have a simple underlying model that I could use to create essentially a optical breadboard of whatever dimensions that I want, and I want this to be very, very adjustable. I also thought that this would be a nice opportunity to look at some basics and to discuss how this could be applied to other things. So you could easily take what I'm going to show here and transform it into, say, a 96 well plate. Now, normally, if I were making this, I could just use a grid. This is sort of how the Perovskite nodes works, where I would just have a grid, I'd instance one square with a cutout on it over and over and over again, and then it would always be uniform. I've done something a little different this time, where I've made the cell count and the row size sort of independent of each other. So if I wanted to, you can see I can change this, and it doesn't actually always fill out. So actually, let's go back to 5. We'll bring the cell count down to 12. And now you can see that I have a non-uniform, if you want to call it that, optical breadboard. I've never actually seen a piece like this in real life. If you did, it means someone probably took a hacksaw to it. But this is just a nice little feature because it gives that one extra bit of customization, and it's also a very good opportunity to look at a sort of teaching example. So I'm not going to recreate this from scratch. Instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to come through and we're going to look at what's going on bit by bit. So we'll start with the offset line. Very, very simply, this is a mesh line. And before we start that, we're going to go through some of the other controls. So I can control the hole radius, and it's limited, so it can't actually exceed the bounds. I can control the hole resolution, which is essentially how smooth this cutout is going to be for reasons that we'll talk about later. I can control the thickness, and of course the material. A second bevel attribute is here, or bevel modifier is here, so if I want those nice rounded edges, I can add those in very simply. So let's return to our mesh line and take a look at what's going on bit by bit. We'll start by very simply adding in a viewer, so Control, Shift, and left click. Unfortunately, screencast keys don't work in the newest version of Blender that I have, and I'll update that as soon as I can. All we're doing here is taking a cell count and plugging that into the count for the line. So how many points do we have? And to visualize that, we're actually just going to go ahead and hit Alt, Shift, and left click, and we see that we have one line going all the way out to 14 points. Or rather 15 points, because the index starts at 0. Now, the offset between each of these points is 2 meters, and I'm using that as a standard value throughout. So I have 2 meters here, and I'm going to multiply all of the offsets by 2 so that I can get the effect that I'm looking for. Now, what are these offsets? Well, if I go ahead and I Control-Shift-click this, so you can see this is the value of the index. What I'm going to do for the x-axis is I'm going to take the remainder, or the modulo, of the x based on the row size. So this is 5. In this case, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then as soon as it hits that 5, it's going to drop back down to 0. It'll just keep going for as many of these as I have. If I had a non-uniform number, it would just go up as high as it could. Now, if I were to go ahead and remove the y from this combine xyz that I have into this set position, now we'll see what the output of this is, you can see it just looks like one shorter line. In reality, there's a bunch of points overlapping here, and what I need is every time that it hits this 5, or this 5 rather, and goes back to 0, I needed to offset by 1 unit in the y-axis. And this kind of zigzag line that you're going to see right here is the underpinning of a lot of very simple grid nodes that people make in the community. So Arendelle has some excellent examples of this. Johnny Matthews has a great tutorial that breaks this down as well, I believe. But the very simple idea is I'm going to take the index at each position. For the x, I'm simply putting the modulo, and then the offset I want for the position, so 2, multiply each of these by 2. And we can see what the values are here, so 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 4, 6, 8, same idea, coming back to 0. Now for the y, essentially what I'm doing is I'm going to divide everything by the row size. So you have these decimal values, and then the floor function is just going to say, if this is less than 1, make it 0. If it's less than 2, make it 1. If it's less than 3, make it 2, etc. If it's less than 4, make it 3. And that's essentially the idea, is it's just rounding down. Again, I'll multiply by 2, so I have a nice series of offsets, and this is going to create my zigzag line. If you really wanted to, you could get into this in the Z direction as well to create a 3D grid, and I believe that's the actual underpinning of Arundel's 3D grid node. Now, down here, I'm looking at pretty simple setup for the squares. I just have a curve quadrilateral, here we go, and we'll just hide that, and a curve circle. Now, the radius here has been limited by simply adding this as a parameter and making the maximum value 0.9. I find that if you go any higher than this, then the bevel can kind of intersect and it gives some ugly looking edges. But basically it's just two curves here and I'm joining those together. You might have thought to do this with mesh booleans. This is an interesting case because I'm going to avoid booleans as much as I can. I find them a little bit slow to calculate, and this is pretty straightforward to just have two curves and join them together. To create the actual grid, very simply, I'm going to take all the points from my line, use those as the points, in this instance on points node, and then I'll take my curve object and instance it on every point. There's my grid. I'm going to translate everything just so that it's kind of off center. So you can see here it is starting in the center, and with the translate, I'm going to move everything off to the side. This fill curve node here with n-gons is actually going to give me my final grid, and then I'm going to realize the instances so that I can do a little bit of work further down the line. Now, this is kind of the key part. It's the extrude and material section. Now, right away, I have the extrude, and I can simply show what's happening here. You might think, okay, this is good enough. Let's just continue from here. But if I were to go to the underside, you can see this actually has nothing. And if this were lying on a flat plane and you were never going to see the top, then maybe that would be sufficient. But in this case, I'm going to have this flip faces node, and then I'm going to join these two together. So you might wonder why the flip faces is in there. Very simply, if I come and I view let's go to the overlays, face orientation. This is the output of my extrude mesh. Blender usually thinks the top face, or rather the normal face, is the one that should be blue. This is important for materials calculations, and glass in particular will not play well if this is not facing in the right direction. Now, if I were to grab this without the extrude, just the bottom, and try and merge these two together, well, you can see Blender thinks this is the top, and this is the bottom. So the flip faces node here just corrects this so that when I join these two together, everything fits. The merge by distance very simply connects everything, and then I have a set material, of course, so that I can make this black. And essentially, that's it. So let's take a look at some of the aspects of the shading and why this can be a little bit unusual. So if I were to change from n-gons, in fact, we'll come back to solve view. If I were to change from n-gons to triangles, and now I come up, you can see this kind of unpleasant effect where it's trying to calculate how to join everything. And if I come in close, you can't really see it. You'll also notice, though, that there's a little bit of obvious filleting around the edges, or you can see the gradations, rather. If you try, doesn't matter if you use n-gons or triangles, if you try and add a shade smooth into this, it's not going to play along, and you're going to essentially have really distorted looking geometry. So with n-gons and with the bevel together, if you zoom out far enough, something like this, you're really not going to be able to tell. That is also why we have the whole resolution here, because I can brute force this if I want and just make it smooth by essentially adding a ton of extra geometry. Obviously, this is going to make the object much bigger, so 27,000, roughly 28,000 verts compared to wherever we were at before. Same number, apparently. That's intriguing. But roughly, this is how you would go ahead and make this effect. So again, you could adapt this for a number of things. I think the grid creation part is probably the most important part, just the understanding of how this line is made and then using that to place objects on it. And again, perfectly good for this optical breadboard. You could use it for other things as well, such as well plates, like I mentioned, and we'll continue on from here. There's a number of assets that I want to release this week, and we're going to start with a Perovskite shader. This is something I made some time ago. I meant for it to be part of a larger pack of science-related shaders and textures that were all procedural that I would release for free at some point. I'm still working on that. Things get backed up, but this is something that I'm going to make available for anyone to kind of play around with, and I'll put this on Google Drive. And I'll add a link in the description for this video. There are a number of very simple controls here. You can change the color, you can change the saturation of the color. So we start off with 1. And this was done rather intentionally because many perovskites that come out of a sort of lead iodide mixture or solution start off as yellow when you cast them as film, and then as you progress over time through the drying and annealing process, they turn darker and black. But you can also adjust the color, so let's say I'm working with a more bromide-rich perovskite instead of an iodide one, so maybe it's a little bit more orange than it is yellow. You also have controls over the grain size. You can make it kind of finer or coarser. And you can control how visible the boundaries between the individual units are, this slider right here. and change the roughness so you can make it shiny, or you can make it kind of a bit more matte. This works with EV or cycles, and again, this will be available for free. I'll link it in the description. This is going to be the next major asset release that I have, and it's an experimental zinc blend diamond cell. So let's come to a rendered view. You can see right here, we've got a very, very simple setup. And this is actually something I'm going to be expanding to, I think, a larger variety of unit cells. It's similar in concept to the Perovskite nodes that I've already released, and it uses some of the same underlying structure. But the difference here is that I have a single unit cell, and it's controlling the overall lattice. So I have a number of options. Let's say bond radius, I want this to be larger or smaller. We'll do this in a solid view just so it's a little bit quicker. So larger or smaller. I can control the separation, the radius size, so I can control the individual atoms, the zinc and the sulfur respectively. I can hide the inner or outer cubic atoms and the bonds connecting them with these toggles right here. Right now, it's not particularly evident because I'm using the same material on both, but if I come in here and say change the sulfur material to this blue, you can now see I have different material colors for the sulfur, but I also have the bond separation between. And this is controlled through this color separator right here. So if I want to bring this all the way up, I can make it blue all the way to the extent, the proximity. If I want to bring it down to 0, then it'll essentially just be the atoms that are blue, but the bonds are all gray. It's a nice touch one way or another. And if you want it dead in the middle, 5 is the number that's going to do that. So this is a basic concept that I've extended over here to the lattice. This uses the 3D grid node from my Perovskite shader, or from my Perovskite nodes rather. And this essentially just allows you to build a lattice. This is a far from perfect approach. I'm using some kind of computationally expensive techniques at the moment to bring this into a more usable framework. I'll refine this as I go and re-release it and update. This will be available on Gumroad. Again, as usual, it's free. But the key thing here that I want to touch on is just how this was made, how this unit cell was made, less so than how the grid was made. So if we come to the Geometry Nodes tab with our unit cell selected, you can see number of controls. Doesn't look too crazy. But when we get in here, we have the individual bonds for the cube, the internal bonding, the sulfur sites and the zinc sites. These are for just scattering the atoms. So essentially there's just a very, very controlled mask here, which is selecting a very specific index every single point in this cube. So it's selecting a specific index and saying only output that one if it's true. It's using a series of Boolean selections to say scatter atoms on exactly those points. But where the really interesting part comes in is in the internal bonds. Right away, you might think, okay, it's another set of nodes, 4-point coordination. What does that mean? It means that for every atom that is at this zinc atom location, I'm connecting it to another 4 atoms. And so when we go in, we have a number of create bond nodes, and this is what we're going to be touching on in the next little asset discussion, because this is something that I'm working on, and I think it's got some very interesting repercussions. So coming all the way back out, into a kind of more simplified version of this, all we have for here is the 3D grid from the Perovskite node instancing this single unit cell, realizing all the instances, and then merging by distance. This is why I said it's kind of a less than clean solution, because this is creating a lot of geometry, then destroying it. If I were to actually visualize the timings here, 240 milliseconds, I can definitely shorten this down and make this a little bit more friendly to work with. So that's something that I will be improving, but for the time being, this is something that people can explore and play with if they want. You have a lot of control, so you're more than welcome to do so. Finally, I want to touch on the nodes that I've been working on to create and build bonds. So create bond is a relatively simple node. It's taking the index at one point in a mesh and saying from point 0 to point 1, create a line. You have a number of controls that extend on that, and so in the build bonds, you can add double bonds or triple bonds. So if I hide the double bond, you can see we have a single bond here. We have all those same controls. So I can move between different indices. So this is actually a very simple plane. If we show the original plane, this is what we have. And this has 4 indices, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 0, 1, and 0, 1, 2, and 3, excuse me. Now, if I build bonds, I can connect between any of those series of points. So 0 and 2, 0 and 1, 2, and 0 and 3. This will also work in 3D space on pretty much anything. So if I go ahead and let's grab a icosphere, we'll create a new geometry nodes tree, and we'll add in our build bonds node. You can see that we're now connecting across anywhere in the icosphere, our little bond here. We have a number of extra controls for things like setting the respective materials, controlling the radii, so let's bring that down to a more reasonable level. And again, let's just cycle through some of these. There we go. So this will always work in 3D space. The really nice thing about this is that when I go to add double bonds or triple bonds, it will kind of put them in adjacent and it pretty much just works perfectly. You have a number of extra controls here, so I can control the bond separation. We look at triple bonds, and then again, I can separate these. I can shrink down the actual bond radius. Let's go to 0.01. There we go. I can enable dash bonds if I want to. And this is probably one of the features that I'm very pleased about, is I can kind of change the bond position. So right now, if I were looking at this head on, it's going kind of up in this way. But what if I was looking at it from the side? Well, then I can actually rotate the bond positions around. So now I have my same triple bond, but I'm looking at it from a different side. We'll delete this object quickly and show the same thing here. So triple bond, if I want, I can go this way, and this will work for the double bonds as well. And we can reset that. So this is something that I think is kind of interesting. There are some things that I'd like to do with this to better flush it out. I'm actually going to make a separate tutorial explaining this and the creation of the zinc sulfide lattice entirely, because that's something that I want to break down in more detail, but this is kind of a preview just to show this is something that can be done, and also to put it out there. These are assets for people to play around with. This, again, is a little bit more experimental. I'll probably be putting this one on Google Drive again, and once it's in a more finished state or more usable, I'll either try to incorporate it into something like molecular nodes with Brady, if he's amenable to that, or I will simply convert it into something else and release that on Gumroad. This is a very worthwhile Blender exercise, which is why it's going to be its own tutorial. But one of the things that I can't help but notice about molecular nodes right now, which is a fantastic add-on, I'm really not knocking it in any way, shape, or form, it's that the way that the bonds are calculated doesn't really allow for double or triple bonds as of right now. And so this is just kind of a way to brute force them. And we're going to extend that brute forcing into creating structures. So right now, the most obvious way that I've done it is I've literally created the diamond lattice by just forcing all the bonds through the different points and creating large scale selections. It's also going to be an opportunity to discuss some of the features that I'd like to see in maybe future versions of geometry nodes, or maybe that I'm just not aware of yet and that are things that someone will point out. I'll be able to do something more expansive with them. So very exciting stuff. Index control, as Aaron Darrell would say, is a fantastic thing to have, very powerful, and we're going to look at that much more going forward. One of the recurring segments that I want to have in the Blender and Science episodes is cover or figure recreation. I really think it helps showcase the tools that are available on this channel and through the Blender community more broadly to people who want to make their own covers or start out doing this professionally. Perhaps they want to make their own figures. People who've seen the channel before might be familiar with my giant page of Advanced Materials Family inspiration, but actually off to the side, there's also a number of figure elements. Today, following up on a request from quite some time ago, I'm actually going to recreate this cover from Nature Chemistry on Ferris wheels. And this is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to give only an approximate overview of the key steps in how you actually do this. And then at the end, I'll let a time-lapse play that I recorded separately, but didn't actually narrate over. So let's go ahead, jump into Blender, and we're going to showcase the final effect and then identify what the key steps are to get there, and we'll run through the whole thing. Starting out in Blender, we're just going to take a look at the final version of the cover that I created. Now, this is not an actual chemical structure. This is 2 caffeine molecules with a sphere in the middle to kind of give the rough approximation. The key thing that we want to focus on here is how to get the molecule in this particular shape. And there are tons of ways you could do this. In fact, Brady Johnston's new molecular nodes are very likely a good tool for this. I'm going to do something a little bit older, just in case people are working from a version of Blender that doesn't support geometry nodes, because this will go pretty much all the way back. The only paid add-on I believe that's being used here is the Go-Ball lights, and you get them on Blender Markets, just creating this nice streak lighting in the background, but you could set up the lighting with all kinds of other tools, so I don't view that as being a particularly essential part of the effect. With that said, let's start in a new scene in Blender, and we'll recreate the very simple molecule effect, and then we'll get into the procedural shader that's used for the rest. In our new scene, very straightforward, we're just going to delete the default cube, come to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and make sure that we have Atomic Blender installed. So this is the key part. If you're using a newer version of Blender, I would say work with Brady Johnston's molecular nodes. It's going to give you a better time, more control, tons of effects. But if you are in an older version of Blender, Atomic Blender is the way to go, and it's going to work pretty much regardless. So from there, I'm going to come to File, Import, PDB, and I could use essentially any molecule here. I'm going to use one of the ones that I've released as a free asset pack before, and in fact, I'm just going to stay consistent and use caffeine again. The key thing here is that unlike the other tutorials that I have for this, which I'll link in the description, This approach makes use of the sticks and bonds, and under setting, we're going to go with skin. From there, we simply import. We're going to come all the way down the collection, grab our sticks, hit M and move those to the main collection, then right click on the caffeine PDB, delete the hierarchy, and this is our final structure. That's it. Now from here, we have a few tools that we can use to make adjustments. If I tap into edit mode, A to select everything, and N to open the side panel, I have this radius for the X and the Y. And if I change these values, drop them both down, I can make this thinner, and if I bring them up, I can make it a little bit thicker. So I'm going to come back, I'm going to say this is kind of what I like, rotate that in view, and then from there, I would just simply set up a procedural shader for Rust. I've already got that shader made, so I'm just going to import it and add it on. And again, I'll release this file free, so it'll be on probably Google Drive, and I'll link it. So if people want to work with the shader themselves, they're free to do so. We'll start by coming into a rendered view. Pretty sure this would work with Eevee or cycles, but I tend to prefer working with cycles. I just think things tend to look a little bit nicer out of the box. We'll go ahead, we'll append, we'll come to that file. So here we are, 2022. Let's grab the shader, procedural Rust material, and I'm very simply going to grab this, come to the materials, and choose the Rust material. We'll move quickly over to the shading nodes just so we can see a little bit of how this works, and then we'll go ahead and break into the time lapse. Here we are in the shading workspace, and you can see this is the entirety of the Rust procedural material. All we have here is object coordinates going into a mapping node controlling two separate noise textures, and each of these is controlling a few different things. The noise here, with this color ramp, is controlling the bump, or kind of the grading of the inner rust part. We'll see the individual parts. So this right here is controlling the rust. This color ramp, which is connected to the same noise texture, but is offset differently, is controlling the distribution of the colors, ranging from a dark black kind of orange to all the way to a sort of brighter orange. And we can kind of bring these in or out to control what extent of this we want. We could also change the color if we wanted, so that it would actually be, maybe a bit more obviously some sort of dark color. Doesn't really matter what. This is all going into our final shader, and you can see this is actually a very decent rust effect by itself. If we wanted to make this a little bit more obvious, we could drop the scale there, spread it out, something like that. But all of this is actually being overlaid with a separate texture for the metal, for the iron. This is the metal, and this bump node right here, go ahead and mute that, which is taking that same color ramp, is adding that extra texture. Now, I'm also using this color ramp to control a mixed shader. So the areas where this is black, and in fact, the same areas that are kind of depressed here by the bump node, are actually the areas where it's going to show the orange. And so you get this edge that looks as though it's got this texture. And then, through the bump node that you have here, separately, you can add a finer texture to the rust itself. And you can see that if you get right into the details. This is much finer noise, if you will, than what we have going on up here. But collectively, this gives us this look of having pockets of rust that have their own unique texture throughout. If we really want to control these, we can just adjust the color ramps, we can change the strength of all the bump nodes, and of course we can spread out the rust by changing aspects of either the scale and the noise texture, or kind of the distribution using the color ramps. So something like that, where it's sort of creeping a little bit more, or where we have it being a little bit tighter, and the extent to which this rust is actually kind of permeating all these cracks. And that's basically the gist of it. So it's this very simple two shader kind of setup, two principled BSDFs, and you have a number of controls for playing around with the rust. I'll leave this open for people to do, but for here, we'll just dive into the time lapse, and then we'll see kind of how from start to finish, including all of the cover setup, you get something approximating that final look. So very quickly, we're going to go start to finish on a recreation of this kind of effect here, how you use this, and obviously this is a very nice figure for something like a website or perhaps a poster, and it's something that we can easily make in Blender. So we're going to go ahead, go to Blender, I'll simply hit X and delete the default cube, Shift A and add in a simple plane. We could do this in cycles and it will work by default, but for Eevee we're going to add a new material, and we're going to make sure we come all the way down to the settings, and for blend mode we're going to choose Alpha Blend. From there, we'll go to the shading tab and do most of the work. In the shading workspace, I'm very simply going to come in here, hit C, come into rendered view. I'm going to make sure that I go to the render properties tab, come down to film, and change to transparent for the background. And then, very simply, I'm going to grab my principled shader, hit Control T, and for this to work, you need to have Node Wrangler enabled. I'll change from UV to Object, and then I'm going to select this image texture, and with Shift S, I'll change it to a Voronoi. You can already see that I roughly have that same cell effect. So I'll grab all of these, move them over just a little bit, and I'm going to restrict the range of colors. So I'll do that very simply with a converter, color ramp. I'll add 2 more toggles, left click on this little arrow, and let's say distribute evenly from the left, and we'll just choose the colors we want. So I'm actually going to stick with the white. I'm going to change to a kind of green tone here, and in place of this, we'll actually go with something kind of orangey to this effect. And this is actually going to work for my purpose. Now I need to have the little boundaries in between and then a kind of circular mask to cut everything off. So to start, I'll grab my Voronoi, Control Shift D. That's going to make this same connection here. And instead of F1, I'll change to distance to edge, Control Shift and left click to see what's happening there. We've got our nice boundaries. So we'll add in another color ramp. And very simply, I'm going to drag this value down until I have essentially a black and white mask. I'm actually just going to change to constant so I can have a little bit more of a stiff boundary there. Something like this should be fine. And effectively, all I want to do now is merge these two. So I'm going to select both, hit Control and number pad 0, or you can simply add in a color, mix RGB. Currently this is set to mix, and I don't want to do that. I'm going to bring the factor all the way up to the top, and I'm going to change to a certain mode. So either darken or lighten. If I want my boundary to be black, as I can see here, then I want to use a darken or multiply. So something like this should be fine. Go ahead and see the output of that. Now I have the dark boundary. If instead I wanted my boundary to be white, then what I would do is I would add in a color invert right here. You can see that's going to sort of invert the whole thing. So instead of a multiply, I'm going to use a light mode. So something like lighten or screen. Lighten will be fine. And this is going to give us that desired cell-ish effect. Now I'm going to wire up a few things here just so that I can control them consistently. So I'll pull out from the scale, and I'll very simply type in value. So I'll set this to 5. And then we're going to use that same value node, plug it back into the bottom scale. We'll duplicate this, Shift D to duplicate, and then for randomness, we'll start off at 1, insert this into here, and also into here. And the reason I'm mapping all these values to the same thing is that if they were different, say if the scale was 5 for the bottom one and something else for the top, they won't overlay properly. So by having one value control them both, I have convenient handles. So I could make this bigger or smaller, and then for the value, I could bring this all the way down to something like this, or I could bring it to something a little bit more in between. You really don't need the value to go above 0.4 typically to get something pretty nice looking. And if we bring the scale way up, we could get some sort of multiplexing effect, or you could really do this in sort of a heat map type distribution for data points or visualization of various things. Now, the last segment that we're going to do is just create a very simple circular mask. So we'll drag all of these out to the side. We're going to drag out here and type in vector math. And if dragging out doesn't give you the opportunity to add a node, you need to be in Blender version 3.1 or later. So we're very simply going to change to distance. That's going to change this to a gray socket. We'll grab this again. We're just going to go less than. Now, if I go ahead and grab this, I have a very clear black and white mask, and I am going to plug this into the alpha value. This is why we need to change to alpha blend in Eevee. In cycles, this will work by default. So we can control left click and control shift and left click, and there's our final result right there. We have all the parameters that we need to change things like the density of this, the randomness of the borders, and if we really wanted to, we could do a little fine tuning of the borders as well through things like the color ramp. So if I want them to be thinner, I could bring that value in just a bit. If I want them to be thicker, I can bring that out. And this will give you effectively everything you need. Again, if we want to switch to have dark borders, then we just change to a darken multiply mode, and then we can have the invert here. And this would work, again, with all of those same adjustments. So very, very simple, nice figure to make. And you can throw this on the website, a poster, etc., etc. Let's move along. In this episode, I want to take a look at the dual mesh node. I want to do that for a very particular reason. Dual mesh as a feature exists in geometry nodes, but it used to be part of the tissue add-on in older versions of Blender. Very simply, all it does is it takes faces and turns them into vertices. And it happens to also take vertices and convert them into faces, and it transfers the attributes. That could be quite useful. Mainly, where you'll see this applied is together with the triangulate node to create hexagons. So this is very useful for creating, say, graphene or carbon nanotubes. That's what I've used it for. However, dual mesh speaks to kind of a more interesting thing about when you start working with Blender more extensively, where you're going to see it relate your science to some of the underlying mathematics and the art that drives them. And specifically, it always reminded me of the Vignazite cell. My apologies for the pronunciation, I'm sure I'm butchering that. But the rough idea here is that this is something that I first encountered way back in undergrad for essentially creating unit cells. And it happens to obviously line up very nicely with Voronoi decomposition, which is another area where this kind of really solidifies this concept for me. It's that first time when you see it. It's actually very prominently featured in the Perovskite shader that I worked with. But dual mesh kind of always clicked for me in that way. And it's that important connection of, be mindful when you're working with Blender. It's not just one of those things where, you're out here to visualize your science. And there are many people in the community who will say, okay, well, you have to visualize your science, but you also have to be very accurate about how you visualize your science. You can't make things kind of unrepresented. But beyond that, there's also the level of think about how these tools can help you better understand the work that you're actually doing and the systems that you're trying to work with. There's a point where you get to modeling things in Blender where you can finally kind of say, you know what, I think I can actually convert this into something that's even more usable. Or I might be able to do something kind of intriguing with this, maybe some kind of modeling, maybe something like I can create a series of data sets for preemptive machine learning applications. And this is something that I think really could be explored more in the community. It always kind of solidifies at home for me with the Vignazite cell and also with Voronoi in general. But dual mesh is certainly a feature that's kind of worth exploring more. If you really want to take a bigger look at it, then I encourage anyone to check out Integma's video from, I think, 2-3 years ago. Similar concept, it explores dual mesh in its entirety in Houdini. But really, it is a fantastic tool, something to be explored, but just generally something that I think people should be thinking about when they're working with Blender. How is this not just visualizing your science, but how is it helping you explain your science? That's one of the things that I like so much about geometry nodes is by decomposing a system or rebuilding it from scratch, you can, if you pay close enough attention, get some really nice insight into kind of the underlying purpose of what's going on. And that can in turn help you design or understand the research that you're doing. This is the part of episode 2 that I am by far most excited about. The community has been absolutely on fire recently. There's so many exciting things here. I've had to re-record this clip 3 or 4 or 5 times because I keep clipping the audio because I'm so excited about what's going on here. I want to start off at the beginning with Brady Johnston's incredible molecular nodes. These have now been updated for Blender version 3.2 and the tutorials have started to roll out. The installation is dead simple. The use to import molecules and to animate proteins is incredible. The ability to work with molecular dynamics relatively straightforwardly. Again, an incredible add-on. So many nice to have features that are just built into this package, and the tutorials that Brady keeps publishing and is going to continue publishing. This is an outstanding effort. It's one of the better things to have ever happened for the Blender and Science community. Really, really, really strongly encourage A, checking this out, B, going to subscribe to Brady, and C, making it so that he can actually have a swimming pool filled with coffee. Check him out and go support him on Buy Me a Coffee. This is an incredible thing that he has put together. This is not just an incredible thing he's put together, but it's an incredible thing that he's put together and released for free. Not to be outdone, Verena from Luminous Labs has put out a series of tutorials on not just the styling of molecules, so you can now import your molecules with molecular nodes, and then you can style them so that they look absolutely beautiful. But she also has 2 new videos on journal cover design for those who are looking to get started professionally in scientific illustration. These really give you pretty much everything that you would need as a quick start guide for how you would want to get going with this. Fantastic series of videos, absolutely worth checking out. Probably the least exciting part of this community showcase is actually my own work this time, so I have some updates for the cell builder prototype and the Perovskite nodes, which are now updated to work with newer versions of Blender, namely in 3.2, so all the features are fully supported. Again, these are free, you can go grab them on Gumroad at any point if you want. let's get on to probably one of the more interesting things that's happened this week. So don't be fooled. This is a render. This is a series of renders of a variable attenuator created by one of the members of our Blender and Science Discord, Jojo. This stuff is incredible. This is actually building on the LuxCore use of lasers that Michael Douglas created and that I mentioned in episode 1 of Blender and Science. So using that setup and a number of freely available, well, sort of freely available parts from Thor Labs, he has created this incredible construct that actually shows all of these optics in a way that is really mind-blowing. It looks real. It looks as though this could be an actual thing that you would see on an optical table in a lab. If you want to go and download the file and play with it, it's been made available on our community Discord with a few copyright disclaimers, but this is now something that you can go grab, explore, absolutely worth doing. Again, it's just such an incredibly mind-blowing week for our community. It's so cool, some of the stuff that's come out. Following on the note of incredible community developments, This Illustrations has released a series of videos on different topics, but the two that I really want to touch on right now are this video demonstration of atomic force microscopy, all done with geometry nodes. So you have a tip that is interacting with this surface, you have the laser deflection, you have the raster creation of the image. There's a number of different controls built in, so you can control things like the density. You can also control, if we skip ahead, what the actual substrate is. So if you don't want nanoparticles, you want something more like a defined mesh, you can actually switch there into something like this. This is a really incredible use of geometry nodes, interactive, educational. These are fantastic resources. And of course, not to be outdone, they went ahead and they created the same thing, but for XRD. So now you can actually see your diffraction angles and you can kind of visualize what's happening with Bragg's law. This is super cool. You can change everything down to the specific X-ray that you're using. So you want to use the cobalt X-ray? Fine. You want to use copper K alpha? Skip ahead and absolutely do that. So there we go, copper K alpha. There are so many cool things that are happening in our community right now with Blender, with geometry nodes, and this is kind of just the tip of the iceberg. These are fantastic. I'm sure we're going to see more of this stuff going forward. Keep an eye on all of these creators. One of the more interesting channels I discovered in the Blender community more generally is Ian McGlasham's. You should absolutely go to this channel, check it out, and subscribe. This is an excellent channel for looking at and understanding much more in detail some of the aspects of mesh, how Blender is going to handle creating good surface geometry, good surface topology, how the shading is going to work, how to actually work with more complex shapes. I'll be using this extensively, particularly for the connecting cylinders, to build a series of glassware assets going forward that have been kind of the bane of my existence because they have things like spigots and valves, and that's true of columns, separation funnels, schlank lines, all kinds of different things, 3-neck flasks. So some of these videos are very, very insightful, and the lessons that are taught therein are more than worth learning if you're trying to work with complex models, particularly things that have cutouts or irregular shapes that you need it to have, or rather you just want it to have good, clean geometry. Ian McGlasham on YouTube. Check this channel out. Absolutely throw a subscribe at him. It's kind of absurd to me that it's only got 1.34 thousand subscribers. This is a fantastic channel, and the details following the chess piece series alone will give you so much information about how to be a better modeler in Blender. The last community feature I want to touch on is the ACA, American Crystallography Association art contest that is currently running on the Blender.Science Discord. It's open until July 10th and essentially invites people to submit a crystal structure of some variety for consideration in our little contest, which the details of which are on the Discord, and also to the ACA itself. So we have a number of entries. The community is going to vote on which ones they like the most going forward. And this is something that, we'd love to see more of this. If you want to get involved, please come join our Discord. I'll put the link to that in the description. Full credit to Michael Aristoff for kicking this off. It's a fantastic effort. We really hope to be doing more of this as we go forward. I'm back to round out episode 2. Hopefully this has been useful, informative. The assets, breakdowns, community showcases, and some of the other features that we touched on today, including upcoming tutorials and new releases. Please check out our Blender.Science Discord contest for the ACA. And as well, I strongly encourage checking out Brady Johnston's Molecular Loads, going to support them, Verina's tutorials, some of the other resources mentioned throughout. We'd love to have you on the Discord. I really want to thank my Patreon supporters as always. This is a video that, as you can tell from the time, took quite a bit longer than usual. It's, I think, the longest I've released to date. So we're going to be covering a few more things of this length going forward, but we will be back to shorter tutorials in the near future. As always, thanks for coming out, and until next time, you have yourselves a great old day.